Picture a room where the only light comes from a single flickering candle, illuminating the careful hands of a monk as he copies a text that has survived for centuries. This is not just any room, it is a scriptorium, one of the beating hearts of the medieval world, where knowledge was painstakingly preserved word by word, line by line. These quiet spaces were arks of human thought, sheltering everything from philosophy and science to poetry and sacred writings. Yet for all their dedication, these guardians of memory could not always protect what they cherished. What if I told you that the greatest threat to our understanding of the medieval era wasn't a single disaster or invasion, but something far more subtle and far more sinister, a slow, deliberate silencing? A hidden war was waged not with swords and fire, but with neglect, ideology, and silence, and its casualties were some of the most profound treasures of human civilization. We often imagine history in grand strokes: wars won, empires fallen, revolutions sparked, but some of the most pivotal battles were fought in the shadows, in the quiet corners of monasteries and the dusty shelves of libraries. This is the story of the lost codices, the manuscripts that held the voices, dreams, and wisdom of generations, only to vanish as if they were never there. It's a story of how medieval libraries, those vast repositories of memory, were silently dismantled, dispersed, and destroyed, not in one dramatic event, but through a combination of religious fervor, political greed, simple human indifference, and the slow, patient work of time itself. And what was lost in that process wasn't just ink on parchment, it was connection, it was context, it was the very foundation of how we understand who we are. So today, we're going to unravel that mystery. We'll walk through empty cloisters and looted archives, trace the journeys of books that were burned, repurposed, or simply forgotten, and ask the haunting question: what happens when a society loses access to its own intellectual roots? This isn't just about the past, it's about us, because the way we remember and forget shapes our identity, our values, and even our future. By the end of this journey, you'll see why these fragile threads to the past matter more than ever, and how their loss still echoes in the gaps of our collective story. So come with me, let's step into the silence and listen for what was meant to be erased and discover what it truly means when memory is under siege. Step into the quiet of a 9th century monastery as the sun sets, where the only sounds are the soft scratching of a quill and the gentle turning of a page. Here, in a room known as the scriptorium, the intellectual heartbeat of the medieval world thrived. Far from the chaos of the outside world, monks dedicated their lives to a singular, sacred task: preserving knowledge. Each manuscript they created was a fortress against forgetting, a tangible thread connecting the present to the wisdom of antiquity. These men were not merely copyists, they were guardians of memory, and their workshops were the very engines of culture during an era often mislabeled as dark. The scholar Alcuin of York called them arks of wisdom, and it is no exaggeration. Within these walls, the works of Virgil, Plato, and Augustine were saved from oblivion, copied and recopied alongside biblical texts and the writings of the Church Fathers. This was a golden age, a silent renaissance of scholarship that would lay the foundation for everything to come. The process of creating a single book was a monumental undertaking, a blend of devotion, artistry, and grueling labor. It began not with ink but with the skin of animals. Parchment made from the treated hides of calves, sheep, or goats was meticulously prepared, soaked, scraped, stretched, and dried to create a smooth, durable writing surface. The finest quality, vellum, was so precious that the layout of a text was often planned around the natural contours and flaws of the skin to avoid waste. Then came the inks, crafted from soot or gallnuts mixed with gum arabic, and pigments for illumination derived from crushed minerals and plants. Lapis lazuli for a brilliant blue, malachite for green, and vermilion for a vibrant red. The most luxurious manuscripts gleamed with gold leaf, applied with such delicate precision that it seemed to capture and hold the candlelight itself, making the pages appear to glow with a divine fire. A single monk might spend months or even years on one book, his entire being focused on the painstaking work. The text was first carefully ruled with faint lines to ensure straight writing. Then the scribe would begin, his hand guided by years of discipline to form the precise lettering of scripts like Carolingian minuscule, a clear, elegant hand that improved readability and standardization across Europe. After the scribe, the illuminator would take over, filling the margins with intricate designs, historiated initials that told their own stories, and breathtaking illustrations that transformed the page into a window to another world. These were not mere decorations, they were a form of visual theology, making complex ideas accessible and glorifying the divine word. The binding was the final act, sewing the gathered pages into a sturdy cover of wood, often clad in leather, and sometimes even adorned with metalwork and jewels. The finished codex was a masterpiece of art and engineering, a treasure whose value was almost incalculable. Through this relentless, reverent work, monastic libraries grew into vast repositories of learning, often the only ones in their region. A great abbey might possess hundreds of volumes, a collection that represented an unimaginable investment of time, resources, and human spirit. These libraries became destinations for the rare few who sought learning, the universities of their day. They held not just scripture, but works on law, medicine, astronomy, history, and philosophy. They preserved the voices of the ancient world, ensuring that the light of classical knowledge, though flickering, was never completely extinguished. This concentration of wisdom, however, created a profound vulnerability. In amassing such priceless treasures in one place, these monasteries became targets. Their very success in preserving memory made them a beacon for all the forces that would later seek to destroy it, setting the stage for the silent war to come. But the very sanctity of these monastic libraries made them a target. That quiet, candlelit world of preservation could not last forever. The first great storm to break upon these arcs of wisdom was not one of neglect or accident, but of pure, fervent belief. The 16th century's religious upheavals, the Protestant Reformation, did not just challenge the authority of the Church in Rome. It launched a direct assault on the physical manifestations of that faith. This was the age of iconoclasm, the breaking of images. And to the reformers, the most dangerous images were not just statues and stained glass. They were the very words contained within the bound libraries of monasteries and universities. Texts were seen as vessels of superstition, of popish doctrine that had to be purged to create a purified, simpler faith. A prayer book was not a treasure, it was a prison for the soul, and a bonfire was the only way to set the truth free. Picture the scene, a rabble whipped into a righteous fury by a fiery sermon descending upon a centuries-old monastery. They aren't just vandals, they believe they are doing God's work. They topple stone saints from their niches, shatter stained glass with farm tools, and then they turn to the library. They rip manuscripts from their shelves, their hands tearing the delicate vellum that had taken a monk a lifetime to prepare. The air fills with the smell of smoke as pages, some illuminated with brilliant gold leaf that once reflected divine light, are now tossed onto a pyre to fuel a very different kind of fire. The heat is immense, the ink bubbling and the parchment curling into black ash. This was not mere destruction. It was a sacrament of erasure, a belief that to destroy the object was to destroy the idea itself. In their zeal to create a new church, they were incinerating the old one, page by precious page. In England, this fervor was given the cold, efficient machinery of the state. Under King Henry VIII, the dissolution of the monasteries was not a spontaneous riot but a calculated, nationwide policy orchestrated by his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. His agents, men like Richard Leighton and Thomas Legge, were sent out on visitations to assess the wealth and worth of every religious house in the kingdom. Their reports often deliberately exaggerated tales of monastic vice and corruption to justify what came next, the seizure of all assets, land, and property for the crown. And that property included every single book. The contents of those legendary libraries were suddenly up for grabs. Some manuscripts were sold off to private collectors for a pittance. Others were stripped for their valuable bindings, the jewels and metalwork pried off and melted down, the pages discarded as worthless. Countless more were simply destroyed, their superstitious contents deemed too dangerous to remain. The dispersal was so thorough, so catastrophic, that we may never know the true scale of what was lost in those few short years. The battleground was not confined to the countryside. Even the great centers of learning were not immune. During the brief, violent reign of Queen Mary I, a Catholic monarch determined to reverse the Reformation, Oxford University became a focal point. Protestant scholars and their texts were targeted. In a particularly grim irony, the university library itself, a storehouse of knowledge, was not spared. It was largely emptied, its books burned in the street as heretical contaminants. This act shows the tragic reciprocity of ideological violence. Each side, convinced of its own righteousness, sought to silence the other by erasing its intellectual foundation. A library was no longer a neutral sanctuary for thought. It was an arsenal, and every book was a weapon to be captured or destroyed. This ideological cleansing created a peculiar and haunting category of loss. We don't just miss the books we know were burned. We are haunted by the ghosts of books we don't even know existed. The catalogs of these great libraries were often destroyed with the collections themselves, leaving us with a phantom limb of history. We have references in other surviving texts to works that we can no longer read. A scholar might quote a fascinating classical author whose book has since vanished, leaving us with only a tantalizing fragment, a name without a body of work. The Reformation didn't just create a gap in our records, it shattered the entire mirror through which we view the medieval mind, leaving us to piece together a reflection from the broken shards that survived. But if the fires of Reformation were lit by ideology, the next wave of destruction was fueled by something far more primal, the raw chaos of war. Armies on the march need two things above all else: supplies and plunder. And to a soldier shivering in a foreign land, a library was not a temple of wisdom but a structure full of potential fuel, free kindling, and maybe a few hidden coins. The sheer indifference to the cultural value of these collections is perhaps even more chilling than the targeted iconoclasm we just witnessed. A book wasn't a heresy to be purged. It was just paper and leather, a thing to be used and discarded. During the brutal 30 Years' War, which ravaged Central Europe in the 17th century, countless monastic libraries were ransacked by mercenaries from all sides. Soldiers would tear pages from illuminated manuscripts to stuff into their boots for warmth, or use them to wipe down their weapons. Priceless folios, the product of a single monk's lifetime of labor, were crumpled up to start a cooking fire or used as wrapping paper for a piece of hard cheese. The act was so casual, so utterly devoid of malice, that it becomes a profound metaphor for how easily civilization can be unraveled by simple necessity and ignorance. This utilitarian destruction has a much longer history. Centuries earlier, the Viking raids on the rich monastic centers of the British Isles and Ireland were driven by a similar calculus. To the Norse warriors, a monastery was a poorly defended treasure chest ripe for plunder. They were after the glittering metalwork on the book covers, the gold, the silver, the precious gems that adorned the bindings of gospel books. They would pry these treasures off, often hacking apart the book itself in the process, and melt down the metal into ingots. The vellum pages, the actual text, were worthless to them and were left scattered on the floor, trampled underfoot or ruined by the elements. The survival of masterpieces like the Book of Kells is a miracle, saved only by the quick thinking of monks who hid them in bogs or buried them in stone containers, sometimes for years until the danger had passed. These raids didn't just steal wealth, they severed cultural lineages, disrupting artistic and scholarly traditions that might have otherwise continued to flourish for generations. Perhaps the most consequential act of bibliographic dispersal in the medieval period wasn't the work of northern pagans but of fellow Christians. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 by the armies of the Fourth Crusade was a catastrophic event that sent shockwaves through the world of knowledge. The Byzantine capital was the last great repository of classical learning, a place where ancient Greek texts on philosophy, science, and mathematics had been preserved continuously for over a millennium while they were forgotten in the West. When the Crusaders breached the walls, they didn't just loot the imperial palace. They ransacked the city's legendary libraries and scriptoria. Books were torn from their shelves, their bindings ripped off for the valuables, and the pages scattered. While some manuscripts were carried back to Italy as trophies of war, sparking a renewed interest in Greek learning that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance, countless others were lost forever. They were sold in distant markets, ended up in private collections where they molded away unread, or were simply destroyed in the general carnage. This single event didn't just destroy knowledge, it scattered it to the winds, making it impossible to ever fully reconstruct the intellectual world of Byzantium. The loss was so total that we are still trying to piece it together today. This is the insidious nature of war's impact on memory. It's not always a single, dramatic bonfire. More often, its death by 1,000 cuts a slow, grinding process of dispersal and neglect. A manuscript might survive the initial sacking of a town only to be sold to a merchant who uses its thick parchment to reinforce the sole of a shoe. Another might be carried off as a curiosity by a soldier, only to be left behind in an inn and eventually used to light the hearth. Each individual loss might seem small, but their cumulative effect is a silent holocaust of heritage. The context is shattered. A library is a living organism, a curated collection where books speak to each other across the shelves. When that collection is broken up and scattered across continents, those conversations are silenced forever. We might recover a single page of a historical chronicle in a library in Paris, but without the rest of the volume that remained in a monastery in Germany, a monastery that was burned to the ground a week after the army moved through, we lose the entire narrative. The story becomes a collection of riddles with most of the answers missing. This fragmentation, born from the simple, brutal chaos of conflict, has left us with a past that is permanently, and perhaps irrevocably, incomplete. Yet for all the dramatic violence of war and ideological purging, some of the most devastating losses occurred not with a bang, but with a resigned sigh. When the tithe stopped flowing and the harvests failed, the abbot of a monastery faced an impossible choice between feeding his brothers and feeding the library. The sacred duty of preservation collided with the immediate reality of survival. economic pressure became a slow, silent poison for these collections, a catalyst of decay that was born not of hatred for knowledge, but of simple, crushing necessity. A hungry monk cannot eat a manuscript, no matter how beautifully it is illuminated. A leaking roof cannot be patched with a page of parchment. This was the grim calculus that led to the dispersal and destruction of countless texts through the most mundane of means, cold, hard economics. The most heartbreaking practice born from this scarcity was palimpsisting. The very word comes from the Greek for scraped again, and it describes a process as pragmatic as it is tragic. Parchment was incredibly expensive and time-consuming to produce. If a text was deemed obsolete, perhaps an old theological commentary that had fallen out of favor, or a classical work that seemed less important than the new liturgical volume the monastery needed, the parchment was too valuable to waste. So the original text would be scrubbed and scraped away with pumice stone and milk or oat bran, a laborious process that left the surface faintly scarred but ready for a new work. To the monks doing the work, this was sensible recycling. To us, centuries later, it is an act of historical overwriting, like recording a new song over a priceless master tape. Modern technology can sometimes resurrect these ghost texts lurking beneath the surface, but for every one we recover, thousands remain permanently erased, their original messages silenced to make way for what was, at the time, considered more urgent or relevant. This economic pressure didn't just lead to erasure, it also led to outright sale. A monastery deep in debt to a local lord or merchant might settle its accounts not with coin but with books. We have records of entire shelves being sold off to pay for repairs to a cloister or to buy grain during a famine. Once these volumes left the protective walls of the monastery, their fate was a lottery. A wealthy, educated collector might cherish them, but just as often they fell into the hands of someone who saw only the material value. The sturdy wooden boards of the binding might be repurposed for a small chest or to patch a hole in a cart. The thick, durable parchment pages, especially from large choir books, were ideal for practical reuse. They became patterns for tailors, stiffening for the spines of new printed books, wrappers for shopkeepers' goods, or even linings for doublets and breeches. A page containing a hymn to the Virgin Mary might end up lining a pair of trousers. A philosophical treatise by a long-forgotten scholar could be used to wrap a pound of butter. The sacred had become secular, the profound had become profoundly useful, and in the process, the knowledge itself was utterly lost. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century, while a revolutionary leap forward for the dissemination of knowledge, ironically accelerated the neglect of medieval manuscripts. Almost overnight, the beautiful but labor-intensive handwritten codex looked like a relic. It was slow, expensive, and inefficient compared to the hundreds of identical copies a press could produce. The old manuscripts, once the crown jewels of a library, began to seem quaint, outdated, and even embarrassing tangible reminders of a less sophisticated past. They were often pushed to the back of the library, left to gather dust and succumb to damp and insects, deemed unworthy of the careful preservation they once received. In some cases, they were actively discarded to make shelf space for the new, sleek, uniform printed books. This wasn't malice, it was progress, but in the relentless march forward, an incalculable amount of the unique, the local, and the idiosyncratic was left behind on the roadside. The most systematic example of this economic catalyst remains the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. While we often focus on the ideological fervor for the king and his ministers, it was always, first and foremost, a massive financial engineering project. The monasteries were the largest landowners in England, and their assets were a tempting target for a crown perpetually short of cash. The commissioners sent to inventory these institutions were accountants, not theologians. Their reports meticulously catalogued every silver chalice, every parcel of land, every bushel of grain, and they also listed the books not for their intellectual content but as assets, often valued by the pound weight or by the cartload. Once the monasteries were dissolved, these libraries became inert capital to be liquidated. Some volumes were saved by discerning collectors, but many more were sold off in bulk to booksellers, grocers, and soap makers who saw the raw materials, not the words upon them. The parchment was recycled, the bindings broken down. The great libraries of England, built over 500 years, were largely pulped, repurposed, and scattered within a generation. This was perhaps the greatest tragedy of economic pressure. It made the destruction of memory not an act of evil, but a simple line item on a balance sheet, an acceptable cost of doing the business of the state. But while human hands were busy tearing down these libraries through war and economics, another enemy was always present, one that worked with a slow, patient indifference that made it perhaps the most relentless foe of all, nature itself. Where ideology and greed caused sudden, violent ruptures, natural disasters and the gradual process of decay acted like a constant, low-grade fever, weakening and eventually killing these repositories of knowledge over decades or even centuries. A monastery built to last for eternity was still made of stone, wood, and parchment materials that are no match for the relentless forces of fire, water, and time. This was a war of attrition fought not in years, but in moments of catastrophic accident and the imperceptible creep of ruin. The enemy had no motive, no hatred, no desire for plunder. It simply was, and in its passive existence, it erased as much as any army or zealot ever did. Fire was the most dramatic and total of these natural agents. We all know the legendary story of the Library of Alexandria, a symbol of catastrophic loss, but for every Alexandria, there were 100 smaller, unrecorded tragedies in medieval towns and abbeys. A library was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The buildings themselves were often made of wood, and within them were candles for reading, rush lights for illumination, and braziers for warmth, all nestled alongside shelves of dry, precious parchment. A single overturned candle, a stray ember from a hearth, or a lightning strike on a thatched roof could undo centuries of preservation in a single night. The fire that consumed the Cotton Library in London in 1731, while later than our period, is a perfect and heartbreaking example. This collection held the foundational texts of early English history, like the unique manuscript of Beowulf and the Lindisfarne Gospels. The fire ravaged the library, and though many manuscripts were saved, they were horrifically damaged, their edges charred and brittle, the text blackened and lost in places. Conservators today still painstakingly work on these scorched relics, but the damage is a permanent scar, a visual testament to how quickly flame can devour memory. Yet for every sudden inferno, there was a slower, more insidious threat: water. Dampness was the silent killer in stone-walled scriptoriums and libraries. In a cool, humid climate, moisture would seep into the very walls, creating the perfect environment for mold to bloom across priceless pages, its thread-like hyphae eating away at the ink and staining the vellum with ugly, irremovable spots. Rot could set in, causing the pages to stick together into a single, solid block of decomposed pulp. A book turned back into something resembling the organic matter it came from. And then there were the pests. Bookworms, which are not worms at all but the larvae of beetles, would bore tiny, meandering tunnels through the pages, their paths a chaotic map of consumption. Mice and rats, seeking nesting material, would shred the edges of texts, nibbling away at marginalia and sometimes entire passages. You can find medieval manuscripts today with these tiny bite marks still visible on the edges, a small but poignant reminder of the constant battle against nature's smallest scavengers. The history of the monastic library at Bobbio in Italy is a chronicle of this slow decay. Founded by the Irish monk Saint Columbanus in the 7th century, Bobbio became one of the greatest libraries of the early Middle Ages, a beacon of learning that preserved many classical Latin texts that might have otherwise been lost. But its location, while beautiful, was not kind to its collection. Damp from the nearby Trebbia River and the general humidity of the region conspired against the parchment. Over centuries, manuscripts succumbed to mold and rot. The very act of trying to save them sometimes made it worse. Later, well-meaning librarians would sometimes over-tighten the bindings or use damaging chemicals in attempts at cleaning, accelerating the deterioration. Many of its greatest treasures were lost not to a dramatic event, but to this gradual, heartbreaking decline, page by page, word by word, into illegibility. This is the cruelest aspect of natural decay, its inevitability. You can lock a book away from fanatics and soldiers, but you cannot lock it away from time. The second law of thermodynamics applies to libraries as much as to anything else. Everything tends toward disorder. Entropy is the ultimate censor. Preservation, then, is not a one-time act but a continuous, desperate race against this universal constant. Every moment a medieval manuscript sits on a shelf, it is in a state of slow, inexorable collapse. The ink is fading, the parchment is becoming more brittle, the binding is weakening. The work of modern conservators is to slow this process down, to fight a holding action against the inevitable. They do so with climate-controlled rooms, specialized boxes, and painstaking repairs, but they are only buying time. Nature, in the end, always wins. These natural agents were the silent partners in the war on memory, often finishing the job that human action started. A library scattered by war might have had its books survive individually, but if those books were then stored in a damp castle or a rodent-infested attic, nature would complete the destruction that man had only begun. It reminds us that the greatest threat to our past is often not a malicious act, but simply the quiet, patient, and utterly indifferent passing of time. But the forces arrayed against these libraries were not always as chaotic as a marauding army or as passive as creeping damp. Some of the most effective and calculated destruction came from the highest levels of authority, from institutions that understood the power of the written word and were determined to control it absolutely. This was the cold, deliberate work of censorship and suppression, a targeted campaign to silence voices that challenged the prevailing orthodoxy of church and state. Imagine not a mob of fervent believers, but a somber, official delegation arriving at a monastery gate. They are not there to plunder or to seek warmth. They are there on a mission of intellectual purification, armed with lists and a chilling sense of purpose. Their goal is not to steal the library's wealth, but to sanitize its very soul. The most powerful tool in this arsenal was the Index of Forbidden Books. The most famous of these, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, was formally established by the Catholic Church in the 16th century, but the practice of banning books is as old as authority itself. These were not mere suggestions. They were legally enforceable catalogues of texts that were deemed heretical, immoral, or politically dangerous. To own, read, or distribute a book on the index was a serious sin and often a crime, punishable by fine, imprisonment, or worse. The creation of such a list was a masterstroke of intellectual control. It didn't just react to dangerous ideas. It proactively shaped the entire landscape of what was permissible to think and know. A librarian, upon receiving a new edition of the Index, was faced with a terrible duty to scour his own collection and remove any condemned work. This meant that the guardians of knowledge were forced to become its executioners, compelled to dismantle the very collections they had sworn to protect. The enforcement of this censorship often fell to figures like the inquisitors. Picture one such man, a learned cleric, moving slowly through the silent aisles of a great library. His eyes are not filled with the wonder of discovery, but with the sharp scrutiny of a censor. He pulls a volume from the shelf, his fingers tracing the elaborate script. He is not reading for wisdom or beauty, he is scanning for danger, a passage on astrology that might imply a challenge to divine providence, a philosophical argument that leans too close to paganism, a historical account that portrays a pope in an unfavorable light, or, most dangerously, a vernacular translation of the Bible that could allow ordinary people to interpret scripture for themselves, bypassing the authority of the priesthood. With a grim nod, the book is handed to an assistant and tossed into a growing pile on a cart. These were not the rarest or most outdated texts. They were often the most current, the most challenging, the most alive with new ideas. They were the ones that threatened to change things. The final act of this grim ritual was a public spectacle designed to terrify and educate in equal measure. The confiscated books would be hauled to the town square and piled high in a pyramid of parchment and binding. A torch would be applied, and the community would watch as the dangerous ideas were transformed into smoke and ash. These were not quiet, hidden acts of disposal. They were grand performances of power, a message to everyone watching. This is the fate of forbidden knowledge, and by extension, the fate that awaits those who seek it. The burning was a purification, but it was also a warning. It created a chilling effect that extended far beyond the square, causing people to second-guess what they read, what they wrote, and even what they thought. Self-censorship became the most effective tool of all, as the potential cost of intellectual curiosity became terrifyingly high. Perhaps no example is more stark than the near-total erasure of the Cathar faith in the south of France during the Albigensian Crusade of the 13th century. The Cathars held a dualist belief that was considered a profound heresy by the Church in Rome. When the crusade was launched to exterminate this belief, it targeted not just the people, but their entire intellectual world. Cathar priests, known as perfecti, had their own scriptures, their own commentaries, their own theological traditions. As castles fell and communities were dispersed, the invaders made a systematic effort to find and destroy every Cathar text they could lay their hands on. They were so thorough that today, we have almost no original Cathar writings left. Everything we know about their beliefs comes from the writings of their enemies, the Catholic palimpsists who argued against them, the transcripts of the Inquisition that tried them. It is as if we are trying to understand a beautiful, complex painting by only looking at the angry scribbles critics made about it in the margins of their notebooks. An entire worldview, a complete alternative way of understanding God and the universe, was deliberately and successfully silenced. The void left behind is absolute. This is the ultimate goal and the lasting damage of such suppression. It wasn't merely about the physical destruction of objects. It was about the control of narrative and Chinese letter of memory. By ensuring only one approved version of history, theology, and science could survive, the authorities of the past sought to make their power seem inevitable and eternal. Any dissenting voice, any alternative theory, any challenge to the established order was removed from the record, creating the illusion of a unanimous and unbroken tradition. For historians today, this creates a profound and often insurmountable problem. The historical record we have inherited is not a complete tapestry. It is one that has been heavily edited, with entire threads pulled out and the gaps clumsily rewoven to support the narrative of the victors. We are left with the haunting knowledge that some of the most interesting, provocative, and transformative ideas of the medieval period are lost to us forever, not by accident but by design. The silence in the archives is not empty. It is a silence that was deliberately and often brutally imposed. But even when a manuscript survived the flames of zealots, the looting of armies, and the slow decay of neglect, its battle was not yet over. Perhaps the most insidious form of loss was not destruction, but dispersal. A library is far more than a random assortment of books. It is a curated universe, a carefully constructed ecosystem where each volume speaks to the ones beside it. The collected works of a monastery represented the intellectual journey of that community over generations. A chronicle next to the land deeds it recorded, a theological commentary facing the pagan philosophy it sought to refute, a medical text bookended by books of prayer for the sick. This context is the soul of a collection. To break it apart is to shatter that soul, leaving behind a body of fragments that, while physically intact, have lost their meaning and their voice. This was the quiet tragedy of the diaspora of books, a scattering that turned coherent memory into a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Consider the journey of a single, magnificent codex from a dissolved English monastery. It doesn't end up on a pyre. Instead, it is sold off in a lot with 24 other volumes to a London stationer. That stationer, seeing more value in parts than in the whole, makes a devastatingly pragmatic decision. He takes a sharp knife and carefully slices out the most beautiful illuminated initials and miniatures. These he sells individually to printmakers or wealthy collectors who want a piece of medieval beauty to frame on their wall. The now mutilated text block, stripped of its artistic glory, is sold to a bookbinder who might use its still strong parchment to create stiffening strips for the spines of new, fashionable printed books. The original wooden boards of the binding, perhaps carved with the insignia of the abbey that created it, are discarded or repurposed for a small box. In this process, a unique, integrated masterpiece of art and text is atomized. The image is separated from the word it was meant to illuminate. The book is severed from its binding, which was itself a record of its origin. A single object becomes a handful of commodities, its integrity sacrificed on the altar of the market. This practice of breaking books for profit became a dark art in the emerging antique book trade, particularly from the 18th century onward, as a romantic fascination with the Gothic past created a booming demand for medieval aesthetics. Wealthy collectors with more money than historical conscience, often called biblioclasts, would commission dealers to acquire ancient manuscripts solely to be cannibalized. A book of hours, a personal prayer book that represented a lifetime of devotional use for its original owner, might be dismembered, its calendar pages sold to one collector, its miniatures of saints to another, and its beautifully scripted psalms to a third. The book as a complete entity, as a window into a single, unified spiritual world, ceased to exist. It was reduced to a series of decorative fragments, beautiful ghosts haunting albums and display cases, utterly divorced from their original purpose and the community that gave them meaning. The story of Richard de Bury, the 14th century Bishop of Durham, is a poignant personal testament to this inevitable fragmentation. He was one of the great bibliophiles of his age, a man whose passion for books bordered on obsession. He amassed a vast and legendary personal library, one of the largest of its time, and even wrote a famous book, the Philobiblon, The Love of Books, which is a beautiful and heartfelt ode to the preservation of knowledge. In it, he laments the mutilation of books by neglectful users and pleads for their careful treatment. He envisioned his library as a permanent institution, a beacon for scholars. Yet, upon his death, the reality of debts and the lack of a sustainable endowment meant his magnificent collection had no guardian. it was not preserved as the living organism he intended. Instead, it was scattered, sold off piecemeal to pay his creditors. The books he had so lovingly gathered, the conversations between texts he had curated, were broken up and sent in 100 different directions. A collection built with a profound love of knowledge met the same fate as those looted by force, dissipation. It is a powerful reminder that without a system to sustain it, even the most passionate individual effort to combat entropy is ultimately a temporary victory. The consequence of this great scattering is a historical record that is permanently and perhaps irreparably dislocated. We are left with a world of intellectual orphans. A surviving fragment of a historical chronicle might now reside in a library in Oxford, but the second volume that continues its story is in a private collection in Vienna, and the third is lost entirely. We have the text, but we've lost the narrative arc. A philosophical treatise exists, but the marginal notes and commentary written by a monk in the following century, notes that showed how the ideas were being debated and understood, were in a different volume that was used to patch a roof and dissolved in a rainstorm. These books were never meant to be solitary. They were part of a chorus. When you separate them, the harmony is lost, and all we can hear are isolated, lone voices, often singing in a key we can no longer decipher. The diaspora of these physical objects created a parallel diaspora of memory, where the connections, the context, and the conversations that gave the past its richness and depth were silently severed, leaving us with a collection of brilliant but disconnected stars in a dark and empty sky. And so we arrive at one of the most haunting and paradoxical artifacts of this entire silent war, the palimpsist. The word itself comes from the Greek palimpsestos, meaning scraped again, and it represents a practice born not from malice but from desperate scarcity. In a world where the production of a single book required the skins of dozens, perhaps even hundreds of animals, parchment was arguably the most valuable commodity in the scriptorium. It was far too precious to be used only once, so when a text was deemed obsolete, perhaps an old Latin grammar, a theological commentary that had fallen out of favor, or a piece of classical literature that no longer aligned with current tastes, the parchment was not discarded. Instead, it was sent for recycling. A monk would take the codex and, using a rough pumice stone or a knife, would meticulously scrape and wash the original ink from the surface. The goal was a blank slate, a clean page ready to receive a new, more relevant text, often a liturgical work like a prayer book or a psalter. To them, this was a simple act of practical stewardship, making the best use of limited resources. They had no idea they were creating ghosts, for the original text never truly vanished. The scraping process was imperfect, leaving behind faint, ghostly impressions of the old letters etched into the very fibers of the parchment. To the naked eye, these undertexts were often invisible, mere smudges and stains beneath the newer, darker script. For centuries, these double-written manuscripts sat on shelves, their deepest secrets completely unnoticed. They were the ultimate symbols of forgotten memory, not burned, not scattered, but literally buried alive, sealed beneath a layer of sanctioned text. A scholar might be reading a perfectly ordinary 13th century prayer book, utterly unaware that just beneath the surface of the page lay a lost poem by Sappho, a unique historical chronicle, or a philosophical treatise that hadn't been seen by human eyes in 500 years. The past was there, screaming in silence, but no one could hear it. The resurrection of these ghost texts is a story of modern technological wizardry that feels nothing short of miraculous. The key lies in the chemical composition of the original inks. Many early medieval scribes used iron gall ink, which contains tannic acids. When this ink was scraped away, these acids had already seeped into the parchment, creating a permanent, invisible chemical shadow of the writing. Modern scientists realized they could use different wavelengths of light to make these shadows visible again. Multispectral imaging involves photographing a page dozens of times, each under a specific wavelength of light, from ultraviolet to infrared. Specialized software then analyzes these dozens of images, looking for the unique spectral signature of the vanished ink and filtering out the spectral signature of the overtext. It's a digital exorcism pulling the ghost from the machine. Slowly, pixel by pixel, the erased writing begins to coalesce on a screen, often for the first time in a millennium. It is a painstaking, expensive process, but it has unlocked libraries within libraries that we never knew existed. No single discovery better illustrates the staggering potential of this technology than the saga of the Archimedes Palimpsist. This unassuming-looking prayer book, created in 13th century Constantinople, sat for centuries in a monastery library in the Holy Land. In the 1800s, a scholar noticed faint mathematical diagrams and Greek lettering lurking beneath the pious prayers. It was eventually identified as containing previously unknown works by the ancient Greek genius Archimedes, including the only surviving copy of his method of mechanical theorems and the Stomachion, a treatise on puzzles that is considered a precursor to combinatorics. The manuscript was a bombshell, but it was in terrible condition, badly damaged by fire and forgery. In the 1990s, it was sold at auction, and a team of conservators and scientists began a decade-long project to save it. They used not only multispectral imaging but also X-ray fluorescence imaging to see through centuries of grime and damage. What they revealed was revolutionary. The deepest thoughts of one of history's greatest minds, preserved only because a medieval scribe needed something to write on and chose to scrape away a mathematical text he likely could not even understand. The prayer book, meant to guide the soul to God, had inadvertently preserved a cornerstone of modern science. Yet for every success story like the Archimedes Palimpsist, there are countless other palimpsists whose secrets remain stubbornly locked away. The underlying text might be too faint, the parchment too damaged, or the two layers of writing too similar in ink composition for even our most advanced technology to separate them. These manuscripts sit in vaults, tantalizingly close yet utterly inaccessible, their erased contents perhaps lost forever. They serve as a potent metaphor for the entire war on memory. The past is not a clean slate, it is a palimpsest. Our history is written in layers, with official narratives overwriting dissenting ones, with dominant cultures scraping away the voices of minorities, and with the simple passage of time obscuring the original text of what actually happened. But just like the faint impressions in the parchment, the traces are always there, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the right light, the right technology, the right question to bring them back into view. The struggle is to develop the tools to read them before the last traces finally and completely fade away. So what does all this destruction and dispersal actually mean for us today? It means the history we think we know is, in many ways, a carefully edited and profoundly incomplete version of the past. The silent war on medieval libraries didn't just burn paper, it curated reality. It decided which voices would echo through the centuries and which would be permanently silenced, creating a historical record that is not a full tapestry, but a piece of fabric with entire sections cut away. The result is a narrative that overwhelmingly favors the powerful, the orthodox, and the male, simply because those were the people and institutions with the resources and the motivation to ensure their stories survived. Think about the sheer volume of medieval manuscripts that have come down to us. A staggering proportion are religious texts, Bibles, psalters, theological commentaries, and saints' lives. This creates an optical illusion for the modern observer. making it seem as though medieval life was dominated to an almost total degree by the Church. Of course, religion was the bedrock of society, but it was not the whole of society. Where are the records of the bustling merchant guilds, the legal disputes of common farmers, the love poems of the middle class, or the practical manuals for craft and trade? Many of them are gone, lost because they were not deemed important enough to protect in those central, vulnerable monastic libraries. Their disappearance makes the medieval world seem more theocratic, more singularly focused on the divine, than it likely was in the messy, vibrant reality of everyday life. This curation of the past has a devastating effect on our ability to hear marginalized voices. Consider the writings of women. We know that medieval women were not all silent, illiterate figures. There were powerful abbesses who ran vast estates and double monasteries, mystics who wrote profound theological works, and even lay women who composed poetry. But their works had a much narrower path to survival. A text by a male cleric written in a major monastery had a good chance of being copied and recopied by his brethren for generations. A similar text by a woman, perhaps kept in a smaller, poorer convent, was infinitely more vulnerable to being lost in a single fire, a single raid, or simply to decay from neglect. The result is that figures like Hildegard of Bingen or Christine de Pizan are the glorious exceptions that prove the rule, brilliant flashes of light that survived against all odds, while the works of countless other women vanished into the silence. Their absence from the historical record has for centuries been misread as evidence of their absence from intellectual life altogether, which is a profound historical injustice. The same is true for minority groups and dissenting thinkers. The Cathars, as we discussed, were systematically erased. But what about Jewish communities in medieval Europe? They had their own rich intellectual traditions, their own libraries of religious and philosophical texts. But these collections were often targeted during pogroms and periods of persecution, seen as symbols of a faith that was not tolerated. Their loss means we are missing a crucial part of the medieval intellectual mosaic, a parallel conversation that was happening right alongside the Christian one. The historical narrative becomes a monologue instead of a complex and often contentious dialogue. We are left with the winning side's version of events, a story that naturally paints them in the best possible light and minimizes or completely omits the validity of any challenges to their authority. This isn't history, it's propaganda by omission. This selective memory doesn't just live in academic textbooks. It actively shapes our modern identity and even our politics. National myths are often built upon these fragmented foundations. A country might base its sense of self on a glorious chronicle written by a monk to flatter his royal patron, a chronicle that just happened to survive because it was kept in a wealthy abbey. But the competing chronicle from a rival region, which told a very different story of the same events, might have been lost when its monastery was dissolved. The single surviving story hardens into indisputable fact, becoming the official history that fuels nationalism and shapes borders, all while resting on the accidental survival of one manuscript and the destruction of another. We are, in a very real sense, living in a world built upon the shelves of those vanished libraries, inheriting their biases and their blind spots without even realizing it. The gaps in our knowledge are not neutral, empty spaces. They are active forces that push us toward certain conclusions and away from others. So when we ask what was lost in the silent war on memory, the answer is not just books. We lost nuance, we lost counter-arguments, we lost the ability to see the past in its full, complicated, and contradictory glory. We were left with a simplified story, and we have been mistaking that simplified story for the truth for far too long. No great library has haunted the Western imagination quite like that of Alexandria. Its name is a byword for catastrophic loss, a single, fiery event that symbolizes the fragility of civilization itself. We picture a towering inferno engulfing scrolls containing the sum of ancient wisdom, a tragedy orchestrated by a singular villain, a trope so powerful it has been attributed to everyone from Julius Caesar to a conquering Arab caliph. But this dramatic myth, born long after the fact, tells us more about our own fears of oblivion than it does about the actual, far more mundane fate of that great institution. The truth is, the museum and its library did not fall in a day. Its decline was a centuries-long whisper, a death by 1,000 cuts of neglect, shifting political priorities, and gradual dispersal. And this slow fade, far less cinematic than a roaring blaze, holds a much more profound and sobering lesson for the fate of medieval libraries, which would suffer an eerily similar, if less mythologized, erosion. The most persistent legend pins the destruction on the Caliph Omar in the 7th century. As the story goes, after his general captured Alexandria, he was asked what should be done with the library's immense collection. His infamous and likely apocryphal reply was that if the books contained in it conformed to the Quran, they were superfluous, and if they contradicted it, they were heretical. Therefore, he declared they should all be burned. The scrolls were then distributed as fuel to the city's bathhouses, and it was said there were so many that they kept the fires burning for 6 months. It's a wonderfully stark parable about the clash between faith and reason, but historians have largely dismissed it as a fabrication concocted centuries later, a piece of anti-Muslim propaganda during the time of the Crusades. The reality it obscures is far less satisfying to our desire for a clear-cut villain and a definitive moment of tragedy. The actual unraveling of the Library of Alexandria was a protracted affair, a slow-motion collapse over hundreds of years. It began with a shift in political winds. The museum was a royal institution of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and when Rome absorbed Egypt, it lost its primary patron. Roman emperors were often more interested in plundering Alexandria's treasures for their own capital than in funding its scholarly pursuits. Then came the ideological battles. In the 4th century, as Christianity became the state religion, the library's collection of pagan philosophy and science became a target. Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, is historically recorded as overseeing the destruction of the Serapeum, a temple that may have housed a daughter library as part of the campaign to eradicate pagan influence. This was not a single army-led bonfire, but a systematic, theologically justified dismantling, echoing the later visitations of Henry VIII's commissioners. The books didn't vanish in a night. They were slowly purged, their authority challenged, and then invalidated by a new world order. Furthermore, the Great Library was probably never one single, massive repository, but a network of collections across the city, some in temples, some in royal quarters. This decentralization meant its demise was also a story of dispersal, not just destruction. Scholars left for other centers of learning, taking their knowledge and sometimes their personal collections with them. Scrolls were lost to decay in neglected storage rooms, damaged in the city's frequent riots and political upheavals, or simply not recopied as the expensive and labor-intensive process of maintaining a papyrus scroll gave way to the new technology of the parchment codex. Its end was not a dramatic murder, but a long, drawn-out death from a combination of malnutrition, organ failure, and neglect. There was no one to blame and everyone to blame. It was a casualty of changing times. For medieval monks in their scriptoria, the legend of Alexandria's burning served as a powerful, terrifying cautionary tale. Chroniclers would reference its loss as the ultimate cultural catastrophe, a warning of what happened when worldly power or impious hands turned against wisdom. It reinforced their sacred duty as guardians against a second permanent darkness. Yet, in a profound historical irony, they were living through a process almost identical to the library's real, unmythical decline. Their own great collections were suffering death by 1,000 cuts, not from a caliph's decree, but from economic pressure, slow neglect, the quiet damp of a stone wall, and the gradual reprioritization of what knowledge was worth the immense cost of preserving. The Vikings who looted for metal and the debt-ridden abbot who sold off books for grain were agents of the same slow entropy that had consumed Alexandria. Their actions lacked the dramatic clarity of a legendary villain, making their cumulative impact even more insidious and harder to combat. The true lesson of Alexandria, then, is not about the dramatic evil of a single act of arson, but about the banality of cultural loss. It shows us that civilizations rarely lose their memory in one fell swoop. They misplace it piece by piece, through a series of small, rational, understandable decisions made in the face of more immediate concerns. A war needs funding, so a library is sold. A new religious orthodoxy takes hold, so old texts are scrapped. A cheaper technology emerges, so the old masterworks are left to rot. This case study holds up a mirror to the medieval world and to our own, reminding us that the greatest threat to memory is rarely a mustache-twirling tyrant with a torch. It is far more likely to be a budget cut, a change in fashion, a misplaced priority, or simple, crushing indifference, the silent, multifaceted processes that do their devastating work without anyone ever noticing until it is far too late. But perhaps no single event in England encapsulates the silent war on memory more completely than the dissolution of the monasteries under King Henry VIII. This was not a spontaneous outburst of violence, but a cold, bureaucratic, and breathtakingly efficient process of state-sanctioned dismantling. It began not with torches, but with ledgers. In 1535, Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, launched a nationwide project known as the Valor Ecclesiasticus, an ecclesiastical valuation. His agents, men like Richard Leighton and Thomas Legge, were dispatched to every religious house in the kingdom. Their task was to inventory everything: the land, the livestock, the silver plate, and of course, the libraries. These visitations were a masterclass in psychological and administrative pressure. The commissioners were not scholars, they were auditors and ideologues. Their reports back to Cromwell often deliberately emphasized rumors of monastic vice and laxity, crafting a narrative of corruption that justified what was to come, the complete seizure of all assets for the crown. The books, those centuries-old arcs of wisdom, were suddenly reduced to mere line items in a vast account of plunder. The fate of these collections was as varied as it was tragic. Some manuscripts, those deemed doctrinally sound or practically useful, were indeed saved for the king's new royal library. This effort was largely the work of John Leland, who was appointed as the king's library keeper. Leland was a true antiquarian, a man who loved the past, and he traveled the country desperately trying to identify and claim the most important texts before they vanished into the chaos. He managed to rescue a great number, but he was one man against a tidal wave of dissolution. He could only watch in horror as the system he served scattered and destroyed the very heritage he sought to preserve. For every volume he saved, a dozen others were condemned. Texts on saints' lives, medieval miracle plays, and intricate theological commentaries were singled out as superstitious or popish, and were publicly burned in bonfires that served as potent symbols of the new religious order. This was ideological cleansing, a deliberate effort to sever the nation's intellectual connection to its recent Catholic past. Yet for the majority of the collections, the end was not dramatic flames but a slow, humiliating death in the marketplace. The economic engine of the dissolution was insatiable. Monasteries were stripped of their wealth, and their contents were sold off to the highest bidder to fill the king's coffers. This is where the true, quiet horror unfolded. Priceless illuminated manuscripts, the product of a single monk's lifetime of devotion, were sold by the cartload to grocers, tailors, and soap makers. These merchants saw not wisdom but raw material. The strong, flexible parchment was perfect for practical reuse. Pages were torn out to wrap parcels of fish or butter, to line pie dishes, or to stiffen the spines and covers of new, fashionable printed books. The thick, durable wooden boards of bindings, often carved with the insignia of the abbey that created them, were broken up to patch furniture or to become kindling. The sacred was rendered mundane, the profound became profoundly useful, and in the process, the knowledge itself was utterly and irrevocably lost. The anecdotal evidence of this dispersal is both heartbreaking and vivid. There are records of an Oxford bookseller who acquired a huge quantity of monastic manuscripts only to sell the parchment to local glovers for use in their trade. A single surviving copy of a rare text might have been discovered centuries later, its pages being used as scrap paper to record mundane household accounts. The most poignant symbol of all is the practice of bookbinders in the 16th and 17th centuries, using strips of medieval manuscript parchment as reinforcing strips inside the bindings of new books. To open an old volume from this period is to sometimes find a ghost, a faint, upside-down fragment of a Latin prayer, or a musical notation silently holding together a later work of secular history. It is a physical metaphor for the entire dissolution. The old world was literally torn apart to support the structures of the new. The loss was not just of individual books, but of an entire intellectual ecosystem. A great monastic library was not a random assortment of texts. It was the curated memory of a community and its region. It held the chronicles that recorded local history, the charters that defined land rights, the customaries that outlined unique liturgical practices, and the financial records that told the story of the local economy. When these libraries were broken up, that coherent context was shattered forever. A chronicle from Yorkshire might end up in London, while the charters it referenced were burned for fuel in a local inn. The dissolution didn't just destroy objects, it erased the connective tissue of local identity and cultural memory, creating a historical amnesia from which many English regions have never fully recovered. It was a pivotal, calculated moment in the war on memory, proving that the most effective way to silence the past is not always with a shout, but with the quiet, efficient rustle of parchment being repurposed for the most ordinary of tasks. Now shift our gaze to the wild northern seas, where a different kind of storm was gathering, one that would crash upon the shores of knowledge with a terrifying and unpredictable fury. The Viking raids on the monastic centers of the British Isles represent a unique chapter in this war on memory, not one of ideological purging or calculated state policy, but of pure, opportunistic plunder. The islands of Ireland, the coastlines of Scotland and England, were home to some of the most celebrated and isolated scriptoria in the world. Places like Lindisfarne, Iona, and Kells were spiritual powerhouses, and their wealth was not just in their faith, but in the breathtakingly beautiful, metal-adorned books they produced. To the monks within, these were sacred objects, the literal word of God made manifest in gold and vellum. To the eyes of a Viking raider scanning the horizon from his longship, that distant monastery was not a sanctuary. It was a beacon of undefended, gleaming wealth. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 sent a shockwave of terror through the Christian world. It was described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a punishment from God, a whirlwind of heathen violence that descended without warning. The image is one of utter chaos and brutal efficiency. The raiders, likely young men seeking wealth and status back home, would have surged onto the beach, their priority focused on portable wealth, silver chalices from the altar, jeweled reliquaries, and the gilded book covers that protected the sacred texts. A gospel book like the Lindisfarne Gospels would have been a prime target. Its cover, now lost to us, was likely a masterpiece of goldsmithing, studded with garnets and intricate filigree. A warrior would not have gently unclasped it. He might have pried the precious metal from the wooden boards with the point of his seeks, his fighting knife, or simply hacked the entire binding off to be tossed into a sack with other loot. The vellum pages, the actual text that had taken a lifetime to create, were of no inherent value to him. They were discarded, trampled in the mud, left to be ruined by rain or blown into the sea. The destruction was not a deliberate act of erasure. It was a byproduct of a search for bullion, an act of cultural vandalism born of utter indifference. This is what separates the Viking impact from the other catalysts we've discussed. Their motive was not to silence a competing ideology or to repurpose knowledge for a new era. It was a simple, brutal transaction. See valuable metal, take valuable metal. The books themselves were just the inconvenient packaging. We see this in the archaeological record. In Scandinavian burial sites, we sometimes find fragments of beautifully ornamented Irish or Anglo-Saxon metalwork, a crucifix, a brooch, a piece of a book clasp, that had been melted down and recast into a Norse-style piece of jewelry. A corner of a gospel book's cover might end its life as a pendant in a grave in Norway, a silent, twisted testament to the long, destructive journey from a peaceful scriptorium to a Viking warlord's horde. The complete disconnect between the object's original sacred purpose and its final fate as raw material is perhaps the most poignant symbol of this kind of loss. Yet, amidst this narrative of loss, we also find incredible stories of salvation that border on legend, stories that give us the precious few survivors we have today. The most famous is, of course, the Book of Kells. As Viking raids on the monastery of Iona became intolerably frequent, the monks were forced to flee, and tradition holds they took their greatest treasure with them, eventually finding refuge at Kells in Ireland. But the most enduring tale is what happened during these attacks. Monks, hearing the alarm bell or seeing the longships approach, would have had minutes to act. Their response was not to grab personal belongings, but to save the books. They developed ingenious hiding places. Some manuscripts were buried in stone containers or hidden in specially constructed cavities within the monastery's stone walls. Others were secreted away in boggy ground, where the acidic, anaerobic peat could potentially preserve the vellum for a time. The Book of Kells itself shows signs of rough treatment. It lost its cover and some of its pages long ago, damage consistent with a hasty evacuation and a period of unsafe storage. These books that we now see behind thick glass in climate-controlled museums are not just beautiful artworks. They are survivors, refugees from a violent onslaught, saved by the quick, selfless thinking of men who valued their cultural memory more than their own safety. The cultural impact of these repeated raids was profound and far-reaching. They didn't just destroy individual books, they shattered a whole artistic and intellectual ecosystem. The Hiberno-Saxon style, that unique fusion of Celtic curvilinear patterns, Germanic animal interlace, and Christian imagery that reached its zenith in books like the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, was a tradition that required stability, continuity, and patronage to flourish. A master illuminator would train an apprentice over decades, passing on incredibly complex techniques for creating those minute, intricate designs. The Viking raids broke that chain. Monasteries were abandoned, communities were dispersed, and the concentration of talent and resources needed to produce such masterpieces was scattered to the winds. While the style continued in a diminished form, its golden age was effectively over. We are left to wonder what might have been, what other breathtaking artworks were lost in those raids. What new stylistic innovations died with the artists who were killed or fled? The Vikings, often romanticized today as adventurous explorers, were, in this context, the unwitting agents of a cultural dark age. Their actions, driven by economics and opportunity back home, created a ripple effect of fragmentation that echoed through empty scriptoriums and silent libraries for generations, leaving a gap in the artistic memory of Europe that can never truly be filled. But amidst the relentless waves of destruction, there were always a few determined souls who stood as breakwaters against the tide of oblivion. These were the saviors, the collectors, the individuals who looked at a discarded scrap of parchment and saw not trash, but a fragment of a world that was disappearing before their eyes. While empires crumbled and monasteries burned, these passionate guardians fought a quiet, personal war to rescue the scattered pieces of memory, understanding in their bones that a society without a past is a ship without an anchor, adrift and lost. Their stories are not just footnotes to the great destruction, they are powerful testaments to the human spirit's refusal to surrender its heritage without a fight. One of the most poignant voices from this era is that of Richard de Bury, the 14th century Bishop of Durham. In an age where many powerful men sought to amass land or gold, de Bury's obsession was the written word. He was a true bibliomaniac in the best sense, traveling across Europe as a royal diplomat not to broker treaties, but to seek out rare manuscripts for his ever-growing library. He cultivated relationships with booksellers, scribes, and scholars, creating a network dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. But his greatest legacy is not the library he built, but the book he wrote about it. Titled The Philobiblon, or The Love of Books, it is a heartfelt, almost lyrical ode to the very idea of the book itself. In its pages, he doesn't just catalogue his collection, he pleads for the respectful treatment of these fragile vessels of wisdom. He rails against the neglectful reader who leaves food stains on pages, or who carelessly breaks a book's spine. For de Bury, this wasn't just about property damage. It was a form of sacrilege, a violence against the collective memory contained within the binding. His passion was a solitary flame in a gathering darkness, a profound recognition that civilization itself is built upon these fragile stacks of ink and parchment. Across the continent, a different kind of bibliophilic ambition was taking shape in the court of Matthias Corvinus, the Renaissance king of Hungary. His library, the Bibliotheca Corviniana, was conceived not just as a collection, but as a statement. In the bustling intellectual atmosphere of 15th century Florence, the humanist revival was in full swing, rediscovering the classical works of Greece and Rome. Corvinus wanted to bring that light to his own kingdom in Buda. He employed an army of scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders, commissioning the most beautiful manuscripts imaginable. His agents scoured Italy and beyond, acquiring texts on philosophy, history, science, and theology. The result was a library of over 2,000 magnificently illuminated codices, a beacon of Renaissance learning that rivaled the great collections of the Vatican. It was a deliberate, kingly project to create a new Athens on the Danube, proving that the preservation of knowledge was not merely an act of nostalgia, but a vital investment in a more enlightened future. The Bibliotheca Corviniana was a monument to the idea that a library could be the very engine of a cultural golden age. Back in England, following the catastrophic dissolution of the monasteries, a different model of salvation emerged, one of desperate, piecemeal rescue. This was the world of Sir Robert Cotton, a 17th-century antiquarian who witnessed the scattered remnants of England's monastic libraries turning up in the most unlikely places, stuffing the linings of doublets, patching the soles of boots, wrapping market goods. Where others saw rubbish, Cotton saw national treasure. He began obsessively collecting these fragments, these orphan pages and battered bindings. His method was not to acquire beautiful, complete volumes, but to save the evidence itself, no matter how damaged or incomplete. His library became a kind of hospital for wounded books. It was in his collection that the only surviving manuscript of Beowulf found a home, alongside the Lindisfarne Gospels and 2 original copies of the Magna Carta. Cotton understood that these were not just interesting old objects. They were the foundational texts of English history, law, and literature. By gathering them under one roof, he was attempting to reassemble the shattered mirror of England's past, piece by precious piece. Yet, for all their passion and foresight, the stories of these saviors are often tinged with a deep and tragic irony. Their life's work was almost always fragile, vulnerable to the very forces of entropy they fought against. Richard de Bury's magnificent library, the subject of his beautiful Philobiblon, did not survive him. Lacking a proper endowment or a successor who shared his zeal, the collection was sold off to pay his debts after his death, its carefully curated conversations between texts scattered to the winds. The glorious Bibliotheca Corviniana, Matthias's Renaissance dream, met a similarly cruel fate. After his death, the Ottoman Turks invaded Hungary, and his palace library was looted and destroyed. Of his 2,000 beautiful manuscripts, only about 200 survive today, scattered in libraries across the globe, a faint echo of a lost cultural capital. Even Sir Robert Cotton's collection, so vital to British history, faced its own near-death experience. In 1731, a devastating fire broke out in the house where it was stored. The Cotton Library was badly damaged. The Beowulf manuscript was scorched around the edges, and its text began to crumble away, requiring painstaking conservation efforts that continue to this day. The dedication of these individuals underscores a timeless and sobering truth. Preserving knowledge is not a one-time act of heroism. It is a constant, never-ending battle against the relentless forces of forgetfulness, a vigil that must be maintained by each new generation, lest the light be snuffed out once more. Yet for all the stories of individual heroism and tragic loss, a new chapter is being written in this long war on memory, one that doesn't rely on the fragile efforts of a single collector or the whims of a king. We are living in the dawn of a digital renaissance, an era where the very technology that seems to pull us into the future is now being used to pull shards of the past back from the brink of oblivion. The tools have changed from pumice stones and candlelit desks to multispectral imaging cameras and powerful algorithms, but the mission remains strikingly familiar: to rescue, to reassemble, and to remember. This isn't about finding a single lost codex in an attic. It's about using the connective power of the digital ether to rebuild entire libraries that were scattered to the winds centuries ago, offering a form of immortality that the medieval scribes in their wildest dreams could never have imagined. Consider the ambitious and poignant work of the Lost Books of Ireland project. Its goal is not to physically reclaim every manuscript looted from Irish monasteries during the Viking raids and subsequent conflicts, a task that would be utterly impossible. Instead, it seeks to perform a kind of digital archaeology. Researchers painstakingly scour library catalogs and archival records from all over the world, looking for any fragment, any single page, any mention of a text that originated in a known Irish scriptorium. They are hunting for the diaspora of knowledge, one record at a time. When they find a potential match, perhaps a lone illuminated page in a museum in Copenhagen or a fragment of a psalter in a private collection in New York, They use high-resolution digital photography to capture it in minute detail. Then, through the magic of database technology, they can begin to virtually reassemble these scattered leaves. A border pattern from one page can be algorithmically matched to another held thousands of miles away, suggesting they were once part of the same original volume. A unique scribble hand identified in a Munich library can be linked to a half-finished sentence on a piece of parchment in Dublin. They are not rebuilding the physical book, but they are resurrecting its ghost, reconstructing its intellectual and artistic unity in a virtual space where distance and ownership no longer matter. This is memory reassembled not on parchment but in pixels. The technological toolbox for this recovery mission is nothing short of science fiction made real. We've already touched on multispectral imaging, which can see the chemical ghosts of erased texts on a palimpsest, but now, powerful artificial intelligence is being trained to read these once illegible scripts, transcribing them at speeds no human scholar could ever match. Three-dimensional X-ray technology, developed for medical scans, is being used to read the contents of still-sealed or hopelessly damaged books without ever having to physically open them and risk turning them to dust. Fragile wax tablets, often reused like a medieval etch-a-sketch, can have their earliest scratched-out messages recovered, and all of this recovered data, every transcribed word, every digitally stitched-together illustration, every virtual reconstruction finds a home in massive online repositories like the Digital Scriptorium or the Codices project. These are the new universal libraries accessible to anyone with an internet connection, from a professor at Oxford to a curious student in Mumbai. The gates to the scriptorium, once guarded by walls and wealth, have been thrown open to the entire world. This digital rebirth forces us to ask a profound and difficult question. Can a perfect digital copy ever truly compensate for the loss of the original physical object? There is an undeniable, almost sacred aura to the authentic artifact, the ability to stand before the actual Book of Kells and see the very ink mixed by a monk's hand over 1,000 years ago, to observe the faint impression his pen left on the vellum, to be in the presence of an object that has survived against all odds. A screen, no matter how high its resolution, cannot fully replicate that tangible connection to the past, that sense of standing in the stream of history. The codex is a time machine. A digital image is a photograph of that time machine. We gain access to the content, but we risk losing the context and the profound emotional weight of the original. Furthermore, this new power to resurrect raises its own set of thorny ethical dilemmas. When we digitally reassemble a culture's lost literary heritage, say, the scattered texts of the Cathars, who does that reassembled canon belong to? Does it belong to the global academic community, to the descendants of that culture, or to the often Western institutions that funded the expensive technology to recover it? There is a risk of a new form of digital colonialism, where the artifacts of a persecuted people are reassembled and studied by the intellectual descendants of their persecutors, potentially without their input or consent. And what if a recovered text contains information that a modern community finds sacred and secret, knowledge that was never meant for wider circulation? Does the technological ability to reveal something grant us the ethical right to do so? The digital resurrection of erased cultures is not a simple, clean good. It is a powerful tool that must be wielded with immense responsibility, cultural sensitivity, and a deep humility, recognizing that some silences, even those imposed by violence, might need to be approached with care rather than shattered with the blunt force of technology. Despite these complex questions, the overarching narrative of the digital age is one of breathtaking hope. It offers a powerful counter-narrative to the centuries of destruction, suggesting that memory, once silenced, can find new voices. A text that was burned to ashes in a town square 400 years ago might exist in a single copy in a forgotten archive, and that single copy can now be digitized and made available in 10,000 libraries simultaneously, making it virtually indestructible. The digital realm offers a new kind of immortality, one that is based on replication and distribution rather than the fragile existence of a single, vulnerable physical object. It cannot bring back what was utterly destroyed, but it can heal the fragmentation, reassembling the scattered pieces of our past into a coherent picture that allows for new understanding, new scholarship, and a new, more inclusive relationship with the voices the world tried so hard to forget. But this incredible power of digital reassembly forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable and modern battlefield in this ancient war on memory. We now have the technological means to virtually stitch together what was torn apart, to rebuild the library in the cloud. But who, then, does this reassembled treasure belong to? The very act of reconstruction rips open old historical wounds and ignites fierce new debates over cultural patrimony, ownership, and the ethics of healing. Imagine a single, breathtakingly illuminated Ethiopian gospel book, its pages torn apart not by Vikings but by British soldiers during the brutal expedition to Magdala in 1868. Today, its cover might be in a museum in London, 10 of its pages in a library in Paris, 5 more in a private collection in New York, and a single, lonely folio might have made its way back to a museum in Addis Ababa. Digitally, we can reunite them into a perfect facsimile, a whole that hasn't existed in over a century. But this virtual solution does nothing to address the physical reality, and that is where the conflict truly lies. For the nation of Ethiopia, these manuscripts are not mere artifacts. They are sacred vessels of national identity, looted in a violent act of colonial aggression. Their physical return is seen as a non-negotiable step toward justice, a tangible rectification of a historical wrong. To them, a digital copy is a phantom, a polite imitation that allows Western institutions to keep the physical spoils of war while offering a digital consolation prize. It is the difference between having a high-resolution photograph of a stolen family heirloom and having the heirloom itself back on your mantelpiece. The emotional and cultural weight of the original object, with all its history and sacredness, cannot be digitized. This tension between preservation and access adds another layer of complexity to the debate. Major Western libraries and museums often argue that they are the best custodians for these fragile objects, pointing to their state-of-the-art, climate-controlled facilities, their teams of expert conservators, and their ability to make the objects accessible to a global audience of scholars. They frame themselves as neutral guardians of world heritage, protecting these treasures from potential instability or inadequate resources in their countries of origin. And there is sometimes a legitimate fear that repatriated artifacts could be at risk from political unrest, environmental factors, or a lack of conservation infrastructure. However, critics argue that this mindset is a perpetuation of a colonial paternalism, a presumption that the West knows best how to care for the cultural products of other nations. It creates a painful paradox where the very institutions that acquired these objects through conquest or unequal power dynamics now justify keeping them by claiming superior stewardship. Furthermore, the concept of access is questioned. Is a manuscript truly accessible if a scholar from its country of origin must secure an expensive visa, travel thousands of miles, and navigate the often intimidating bureaucracy of a foreign institution to see it? Or is it more accessible to that scholar in its home country, even if the reading room is less technologically advanced? the argument forces us to ask whether universal access is sometimes used as a noble-sounding excuse to retain control over cultural assets that were never meant to be universal property in the first place. The question of private ownership presents yet another ethical minefield. When a priceless leaf from a medieval manuscript appears on the auction block at Sotheby's or Christie's, it becomes a commodity. Its fate is determined not by cultural need or historical justice, but by the highest bidder. This can permanently remove these fragments from public view and scholarly study, locking them away in a vault for a private collector's personal enjoyment. It also makes the work of digital reconstruction projects, like the Lost Books of Ireland, infinitely more difficult, as they must negotiate access with individuals who may have no interest in scholarship or public good. The free market becomes the final arbiter of a culture's memory, a reality that often feels at odds with the sacred duty of preservation that the original monastic scribes would have recognized. This commercialization turns pages of history into trophies, further fragmenting our collective understanding for the sake of private wealth. Ultimately, how we choose to handle these physical fragments, whether we fight for their repatriation, accept digital surrogates, or allow them to be traded as commodities, is a profound test of our values. It is a modern referendum on the sins of the past. Do we believe that the wounds of colonialism and historical plunder can only be healed through tangible restitution? Or do we prioritize a utilitarian model of preservation and access, even if it means the physical objects remain geographically disconnected from their cultural heart? There are no easy answers, and each case requires its own sensitive negotiation, a deep listening to the communities whose heritage is at stake. The silent war on memory did not end when the last monastery was dissolved or the last Viking longship sailed away. It simply evolved, moving from battlefields and burning squares into the hushed boardrooms of museums, the tense negotiations of international diplomacy, and the complex algorithms of digital archives. The weapons are now legal arguments, ethical frameworks, and acquisition policies, but the stakes remain terrifyingly high. The power to finally grant a silenced culture its voice back, or to continue to benefit from its silence. But the true cost of these vanished libraries extends far beyond the academic, beyond the frustration of historians facing gaps in their research. The deepest wound is not to scholarship, but to the human soul, to our very sense of who we are and where we come from. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that a crucial chapter of your family's story has been ripped from the photo album, that the letters and diaries of your grandparents have been destroyed. You would still be you, but you would feel a profound sense of disorientation, a hole in your identity that you couldn't quite fill. Now magnify that feeling to the scale of an entire culture, an entire civilization. This is the psychological impact of cultural loss, a silent, lingering trauma that shapes nations and communities for generations. It's not just about missing information, it's about a collective amnesia, a sense that a part of you is missing, like a phantom limb you can still feel but never see. When a society loses access to the foundational texts that shaped its early identity, it doesn't just create a blank space, it creates a vacuum, and human nature abhors a vacuum. Into that void rush myths, invented traditions, and often dangerously simplified nationalist narratives. Without the complex, contradictory, and nuanced primary sources to provide a check, the past becomes a blank canvas for those who wish to paint a particular picture of the present. A medieval chronicle that presented a balanced view of a king's reign, weighing his triumphs against his failures, might be lost, leaving only a later, heavily biased account that painted him as a flawless hero. That single surviving narrative then hardens into unchallengeable fact, becoming the cornerstone of a national myth that excludes minorities, justifies old grievances, and fuels modern political movements. The silent destruction of those libraries didn't just erase history, it handed a monopoly on the past to the most powerful voices of a later era, allowing them to craft a story that served their purposes, unburdened by inconvenient facts from the original sources. This process inflicts what sociologists call cultural trauma, a shared psychological injury that occurs when a group's sense of its own identity and continuity is severely damaged. The destruction of heritage, whether through war, iconoclasm, or neglect, is a direct attack on that continuity. It severs the tangible links a community has with its ancestors, its artistic traditions, its unique ways of understanding the world. Studies have shown that when cultural landmarks, archives, or libraries are destroyed, it doesn't just cause sadness. It can lead to a deep sense of anxiety, collective depression, and a loss of social cohesion. People feel unmoored, cut adrift from the anchors that gave their community its distinct character and resilience. The recovery of memory, then, whether through the physical repatriation of artifacts or the digital reconstruction of texts, becomes more than an academic exercise. It is an act of collective therapy, a way for a people to stitch their identity back together and heal the scars of that historical violence. So we have to ask ourselves a deeply personal and unsettling question. What does it actually feel like to know that entire ways of seeing the universe have been permanently erased? We can mourn the loss of a specific text like Archimedes' method, but how do we mourn the loss of something we don't even know existed? A complete philosophical system, a rich poetic tradition, a unique scientific understanding that died with its last practitioner and was never written down, or was written down and then burned. We are surrounded by the ghosts of these lost possibilities, these roads not taken in the history of human thought. Their absence is a silence that echoes through our culture, limiting our imagination and narrowing our understanding of human potential. The war on memory is a psychological battle as much as a physical one, and its casualties are the forgotten selves we might have been, the collective wisdom we could have drawn upon, and the full, rich, complicated story of our species that we will never get to hear. So what can we learn from this centuries-long tragedy of loss? The most glaring lesson from the empty scriptoriums and looted monasteries is a simple one. Never put all your eggs in one basket, or in this case, all your knowledge in one library. The medieval world made a catastrophic error in concentration. A single monastic library might hold the only copies of unique texts for 100 miles in any direction, making it a single point of failure. A Viking raid, a fire, or a king's decree could erase that knowledge from the earth forever. Our modern strategy, therefore, must be the exact opposite: radical, relentless diversification. We cannot just create one copy of something important. We need to create hundreds, thousands, and store them in as many different physical and digital locations as possible. This is the core principle that guides every serious preservation effort today, a direct and sobering response to the vulnerabilities of the past. This diversification takes two crucial forms. First, there is the physical safeguarding of original artifacts. We now understand that you cannot simply put a priceless medieval manuscript on a wooden shelf in a damp stone room and hope for the best. The enemy is entropy itself, fluctuating temperature and humidity, light exposure, pollution, and biological threats like mold and insects. The answer is the climate-controlled vault, a technological marvel that creates a near-perfect, stable environment to slow the aging process to a near standstill. Facilities like the British Library's basements or the Vatican's secret archives are fortresses against time, using sophisticated systems to maintain constant, cool temperatures and optimal humidity levels, shielding treasures from the very elements that destroyed so many of their counterparts. This is proactive, not passive, preservation, a recognition that these objects are in a constant state of fragile decay, and we are their temporary guardians in a long relay race against oblivion. But physical preservation, for all its importance, still carries the old risk of concentration. A climate-controlled vault, however advanced, is still a single location vulnerable to a catastrophic event, whether natural or man-made. This is where the second, and perhaps most revolutionary, strategy comes into play: the creation of perfect, immutable digital copies. Digitization is our modern-day scriptorium, but with one crucial difference: the copies are perfect and infinite. A high-resolution scan of the Book of Kells can be replicated and stored on servers all over the world simultaneously. A flood could wipe out the library in Dublin. A fire could ravage a backup facility in London, but the digital copy would still exist on a server in Tokyo, in a data vault in Utah, and on the hard drives of 10,000 scholars. This creates a distributed global immune system for knowledge, ensuring that no single disaster can ever be a knockout blow to our collective memory again. It is the ultimate fulfillment of the lesson learned from the ashes of 1,000 monastic libraries. Of course, the digital realm brings its own set of unique vulnerabilities. Data formats become obsolete, storage media degrades, and the very companies that host our cloud storage could go out of business. A PDF file from 1990 is often harder to read today than a 900-year-old parchment. This is why the most important modern preservation initiatives focus not just on scanning, but on creating robust, standardized, and sustainable digital ecosystems. Programs like the UNESCO Memory of the World program don't just list important artifacts. They provide the international framework and technical standards to ensure that digitized content remains accessible and readable for centuries to come, not just for a few decades. They encourage global collaboration, helping smaller nations and institutions preserve their heritage with the best tools and practices, preventing the kind of silent, slow-motion loss that comes from simply not having the resources to keep up. This global, cooperative effort is perhaps the most heartening legacy of all those individual losses. We are finally learning to work together on a planetary scale to defend what is most precious. And this is where the story stops being just about institutions and becomes about us. The most profound lesson from the medieval world is that preservation is not a spectator sport. It failed when it was the sole responsibility of a few isolated monks in remote locations. It succeeds when it becomes a shared, communal duty. Every one of us can be a modern-day Richard de Barry or a digital monk in this new scriptorium. You don't need a degree in archival science to make a difference. You can start by supporting your local historical society or public library, which are often the unsung heroes safeguarding the unique, local stories that define a community. You can volunteer your time with a crowdsourced project like Zooniverse, where anyone can help transcribe everything from ancient Roman letters to the logs of whaling ships, turning raw data into searchable, usable knowledge. You can even become a personal archivist for your own family, digitizing old photos and letters, ensuring that your own story isn't lost to the same forces of neglect that claimed so much of our past. The choices we make today, from the international policies we support to the personal data we back up, are the foundation stones of the future's memory. The medieval experience screams one undeniable truth across the centuries: memory is not a given. It is not a permanent, indestructible record. It is a fragile, living thing that requires constant vigilance, proactive defense, and a collective will to sustain it. The Silent War never ended, it just changed battlefields. The question is no longer whether we can preserve our story, but whether we collectively possess the wisdom and the will to do so. The empty shelves of those medieval libraries stand as a permanent warning, but the glowing screens of our digital archives offer a flickering, hopeful answer. What we choose to save now will become the only past our descendants will ever know. Yet, even as we safeguard what has survived, the future of medieval studies shines with a promise far beyond mere preservation. It glimmers with the thrilling potential for rediscovery. For every library that was burned or scattered, countless individual codices simply went into hiding, tucked away in the one place time often forgets, the private collection. Right now, in a dusty attic in Normandy, a trunk filled with legal documents from a dissolved abbey might also contain a unique copy of a troubadour's songbook, mislabeled and overlooked for centuries. In the vault of an old aristocratic family, too proud or too private to ever loan their heirlooms, a pristine, illuminated psalter might await, its pages uncut and its colors still vibrant. These forgotten hoards are the unexplored frontier of our field, each one a potential time capsule holding a voice the world has not heard in half a millennium. The next great discovery might not come from a grand national archive, but from a descendant clearing out an estate who decides to look more closely at that bulky, leather-bound book holding up a wobbly desk leg. The tools we are developing to explore these potential finds are reshaping the very nature of historical inquiry. Artificial intelligence is no longer just a buzzword. It is becoming the most patient and insightful paleographer the world has ever known. Imagine training a neural network on thousands of examples of a particular scribe's handwriting. Once it learns the unique quirks and flourishes of that individual's script, it can be unleashed on a damaged or faded page, not just to transcribe the clear words, but to intelligently predict and fill in the letters that have been smudged by water, eaten by insects, or faded to near invisibility. This goes far beyond simple transcription. AI can analyze linguistic patterns across vast corpora of text to identify anonymous authors, suggesting that a fragmentary philosophical text was likely written by a follower of a specific thinker, or that a newly discovered poem shares such striking stylistic similarities with the works of Hildegard of Bingen that it might indeed be her lost hand. This technology doesn't replace the human scholar. It acts as a super-powered collaborator, offering possibilities and connections that a single lifetime of study could never uncover. This technological leap forward allows us to ask questions we never before dared to voice. What if we could finally read the Liber Divinis, the legendary book on wines and their medicinal properties that the great 13th century scholar Albertus Magnus is said to have written, but which is currently known only by title? What suppressed scientific or heretical treatises, those dangerous ideas that were hunted down by inquisitors, might still be out there, hidden beneath a layer of paint on a later panel or sewn into the lining of an old bishop's vestment? The potential is staggering. We could recover the lost medical texts from the school of Salerno that blended Greek, Arabic, and Latin knowledge, offering a much richer picture of medieval science. We might find the personal diaries of a low-ranking monk, giving us not the official, sanitized history of his abbey, but the gritty, human reality of doubt, friendship, and daily struggle. Every one of these discoveries would be a direct assault on the silence imposed by the war on memory, a victory snatched from the jaws of oblivion. This forward gaze fundamentally changes our relationship with the past. We are no longer simply custodians of a static, finite record. We are active participants in an ongoing process of revelation. The archive is no longer a cold storage unit for dead facts, but a lively, ever-expanding crime scene where new evidence can appear at any moment, forcing us to rewrite the entire story. A single discovery in an archaeological dig, a sealed lead casket in the foundations of a ruined chapel, for instance, could upend our understanding of a local rebellion or a theological debate. This work is a powerful antidote to despair. It means that the war is not over and the score is not final. For every act of destruction, there is the potential for an act of recovery. For every library burned, a hidden codex might still be found. The past we are learning is not a closed book. It is a story with missing chapters, and we are only now developing the tools to go back and find them, proving that what was once silenced can, against all odds, find its voice once more. But this history of loss isn't just a story to be consumed, it's an invitation to participate. After hearing about the centuries of silence, you might be wondering what one person can possibly do to stand against such a vast tide of forgetting. The beautiful truth is that the digital age has turned each of us into a potential guardian of memory, and the tools to make a real difference are literally at our fingertips. You don't need a PhD in medieval history or a fortune to donate. You can start from your own home today. Think of it as a form of crowdsourced time travel, where every small contribution helps piece together a past that others tried to erase. This is about becoming an active citizen in the Republic of Letters, helping to ensure that the voices of the past are not just preserved but heard. One of the most direct and impactful ways to get involved is through citizen science platforms designed for this very purpose. Websites like Zooniverse host incredible projects where anyone with an internet connection can help transcribe ancient weather logs, decipher the handwriting on centuries-old ship manifests, or even trace the outlines of Roman villas in satellite imagery. There's a specific project right now called Shakespeare's World, where volunteers help transcribe handwritten documents from the playwright's era, documents that could contain a lost sonnet or a forgotten play. Or consider From the Page, where you can help read and transcribe everything from the letters of Civil War soldiers to the marginal notes in medieval cookbooks. This isn't busy work. You are quite literally reading texts that no one has laid eyes on in hundreds of years, doing the foundational work that allows professional historians to then analyze and understand. Every word you transcribe is a victory against the silence, a direct reversal of the neglect that has been the enemy of memory for so long. Beyond the digital realm, your local community is also a front line in this quiet war. Your town's historical society, public library, or regional archive is almost certainly underfunded and overworked, filled with unique documents and photographs that tell the story of your own corner of the world. These are the places that hold the deeds to your main street's oldest buildings, the diaries of the first settlers in your area, the photo albums of industries that have long since vanished. This local history is just as vulnerable as any medieval codex. Reach out and ask if they need volunteers to help with scanning projects, to organize collections, or even to help with basic cataloging. The skills needed are often just patience and care, not a specialized degree. By helping to preserve the story of your own community, you are fighting the same fight against oblivion, protecting the unique threads that make up the larger tapestry of our shared human experience. If you're looking to deepen your own understanding before you jump into action, there's a wealth of incredible resources that bring this struggle to life. For a gripping read, pick up a copy of The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt, which tells the astonishing story of how one book hunter rediscovered a lost poem by the ancient Roman Lucretius, a discovery that helped catalyze the Renaissance. Or for a more visual journey, seek out the documentary The Booksellers, which offers a fascinating look into the secretive world of rare book collecting and the passionate individuals who rescue treasures from attics and dumpsters. These aren't just stories, they are fuel for the cause, showing you the profound impact that the recovery of a single text can have on our entire culture. And finally, the conversation doesn't have to end when this video does. I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever discovered an old family Bible in your attic with notes in the margins? Does your town have a story about a historic building that was lost to fire or neglect? Sharing these stories of local loss and preservation success creates a living archive right here, a testament to the fact that this history matters to people everywhere. Every like, share, and comment on a video like this might seem small, but it signals to the algorithm that these stories are valuable, helping them reach more people who might also be inspired to help. You are no longer just a viewer, you are a potential node in a vast global network of memory keepers. The silent war was fought by scattering knowledge and hoping we would forget. Our response is to gather, to share, and to remember together. We often picture the destruction of medieval knowledge as a series of dramatic, fiery spectacles, a mob tossing books onto a bonfire, or a conquering army putting a library to the torch. This image of malicious, intentional erasure is a powerful and satisfying story, one with clear villains and tragic heroes. But while these events certainly happened, this focus on dramatic evil obscures a far more pervasive, and in some ways more terrifying, truth. The greatest enemy of medieval libraries was not hatred, but indifference. The single largest cause of loss wasn't a grand act of ideological arson. It was the slow, patient, and utterly mundane work of neglect and economic necessity. For every library that was burned, a dozen more were simply abandoned to the damp, the insects, and the relentless pressure of a bad harvest. We must move beyond the myth of the mustache-twirling villain and confront the banality of forgetting, because it is in these quiet processes that the real tragedy of lost memory unfolds. Consider the life cycle of a typical monastic library in a less wealthy abbey. Its greatest threat was never a Viking raid, which might be a once-in-a-generation catastrophe. Its greatest threat was the abbot's annual budget. Parchment was phenomenally expensive, and when times were tough, that beautifully illuminated but theologically outdated commentary became a potential source of revenue. It might be sold off to a traveling merchant for a fraction of its worth to buy grain for the winter. Once it left the monastery's walls, its fate was a lottery. It could end up in the hands of a collector, or more likely, it could be sold to a bookbinder who would break it down for parts. This wasn't done with any animosity toward the text. It was simple economics. The sturdy oak boards of the binding were more valuable as repair wood for a cart than as the cover for a book no one was reading. The parchment was too valuable to waste. It could be scraped and reused as a palimpsest, or cut into strips to reinforce the bindings of new, more fashionable printed books. This quiet, utilitarian repurposing, born from poverty rather than malice, likely destroyed more unique texts than any single act of war. The very structure of these libraries made them vulnerable to a slow death by entropy. They were often located in cold, damp stone buildings perfect for preservation of the soul, perhaps, but terrible for the preservation of organic material. Without any understanding of humidity control, manuscripts would slowly absorb moisture from the air, becoming a perfect breeding ground for mold. You can find medieval books today with telltale foxing, those reddish-brown spots that bloom across the page like a disease, which is the permanent scar of fungal colonies that feasted on the parchment centuries ago. Insects, particularly the larvae of beetles known as bookworms, would bore intricate, meandering tunnels through the pages, literally eating the words off the page. And then there were the mice seeking warm nesting material, who would shred the edges of texts, nibbling away centuries of marginalia. This was a war of attrition fought not in years, but over centuries, by enemies too small to see and too patient to ever surrender. Another persistent myth we must dismantle is the concept of a monolithic, Dark Age culture that was uniformly ignorant or hostile to classical learning. This idea, popularized by Renaissance thinkers who wanted to frame their own era as a glorious rebirth, is a gross oversimplification. The medieval world was not a single, unified entity. It was a vast and diverse tapestry of intellectual traditions. What was lost reflects that dizzying variety. We didn't just lose Christian theology. We lost Arabic medical texts that had been translated in Spain, Jewish philosophical commentaries from bustling urban centers, unique Celtic legal tracts from Ireland, and secular love poetry composed in bustling mercantile towns. The silencing of these libraries wasn't the erasure of one story. It was the muting of 1,000 different conversations happening simultaneously across Europe. By imagining a dark age, we make the loss simpler and easier to digest, but we do a profound disservice to the vibrant, complicated, and often contentious intellectual world that was actually lost. This myth-busting is not just an academic exercise, it is essential to how we understand the fragility of our own civilization. If we believe cultural memory is only destroyed by dramatic acts of evil, we can comfort ourselves that we would never allow such a thing to happen. But if we understand that the primary mechanisms of loss are far more ordinary budget cuts, shifting priorities, simple neglect, the corrosive effects of time, then the threat becomes immediate and personal. It means the digital archives we are building today could be lost not to a dystopian censorship regime, but to something as mundane as a software update that renders the file format unreadable, or a grant that fails to renew funding for server maintenance. The greatest threat to our memory is not a villain. It is a spreadsheet that doesn't balance, a roof that springs a leak, or a generation that simply stops caring. Recognizing this shifts the responsibility from resisting a fictional evil to performing the daily, unglamorous, and essential work of preservation, reminding us that the fight against oblivion is fought not with dramatic gestures, but with the quiet, relentless application of care. Yet this cultural obsession with lost libraries and hidden knowledge is far more than simple entertainment. It is a mirror reflecting our most profound modern anxieties. The same fears that drove a medieval monk to hide a book from Viking raiders, the fear of censorship, of ideological purges, of losing our connection to truth, have simply found new battlegrounds. We no longer worry about the physical sacking of monasteries, but we lie awake at night thinking about digital decay, about entire cloud servers full of family photos, government records, and cultural data becoming corrupted or obsolete, vanishing into an electronic void as completely as any vellum codex consumed by mold. The hacker who holds a hospital's data for ransom is the modern equivalent of the army looting a library, holding memory itself hostage for economic gain. Our frantic efforts to create digital backups and store data in multiple geographic locations are a direct, conscious response to the historical trauma of centralized loss we inherited from the medieval world. We have internalized their lesson: never put all your eggs in one basket. This legacy also manifests in our heated contemporary debates over censorship and deplatforming. When a social media company bans a controversial figure or an idea, the outrage that erupts is not just about the present. It is fueled by the deep, historical ghost of the index of forbidden books. The arguments are eerily familiar. One side speaks of protecting the public from harmful misinformation, echoing the Inquisitor protecting souls from heresy. The other side screams about the silencing of dissent and the control of narrative, echoing the dissenting scholar watching his life's work burn in the town square. The war on memory has evolved from physical bonfires to algorithmic suppression, but the core conflict remains unchanged, a struggle over who has the power to decide which ideas are preserved and which are erased from the record. We are still fighting over the contents of the library, We've just traded parchment for pixels and town criers for trending topics. Ultimately, the Silent War's most enduring legacy is the shape of the hole it left in our collective consciousness. We are a species haunted by the ghost of a library we never knew, forever fascinated by the idea of a complete, perfect record of the past that we are certain must have once existed. This longing drives everything from our endless conspiracy theories about hidden archives, from the Vatican's supposed secret vaults to government warehouses holding alien technology, to the entire field of archaeology, which is essentially a systematic, scientific search for the books we lost. We are perpetually trying to fill in the gaps, to answer the questions we can no longer ask, to find the wisdom that was scraped away to make room for a prayer book. The past is not dead. It is a missing person we are forever trying to find, and every story we tell about a lost book, every film we make about a hidden codex, is another attempt to call out into the silence, hoping that this time something might call back. So what is the final tally of this silent, centuries-long war? We began our journey in the quiet glow of the scriptorium, where the scratch of a quill was an act of defiance against oblivion. We witnessed that fragile light threatened by the roaring fires of reformation, the cold pragmatism of economic necessity, the chaotic plunder of war, and the slow, patient decay of time itself. This was never a single battle with a clear front line. It was a sprawling, multifaceted conflict waged against memory itself, where the casualties were not just books, but entire worldviews, alternative histories, and the very connective tissue of our cultural identity. The empty shelves and the silent gaps in our historical record are not accidents of history. They are the scars of this war, a testament to how vulnerable our shared story truly is when confronted by ideology, greed, and simple human indifference. We saw how faith could turn fervent, leading mobs and monarchs alike to see knowledge as a heresy to be purified in flame. We watched as armies, blind to anything but plunder, treated priceless codices as kindling or wrapping paper. We observed the slow, heartbreaking decay brought on by damp and insects, and the quiet tragedy of palimpsists, where desperate scarcity forced monks to erase one text to make room for another, unknowingly burying treasures for centuries. And perhaps most insidiously, we saw how the simple, grinding pressure of economics could dismantle a library not with malice, but with a resigned sigh, selling off centuries of wisdom to pay a debt or patch a roof. This war had no single enemy. Its soldiers were the zealot, the looter, the accountant, and the inexorable turning of the earth itself. Yet, even as we mourn these profound losses, this story does not end in silence. It continues in the high-tech labs where multispectral imaging breathes life back into erased texts, and in the global digital collaborations that are virtually reassembling libraries scattered across continents. It lives on in the passion of collectors and conservators who fight a never-ending battle against entropy, understanding that every manuscript saved is a thread pulled back from the void. The struggle has evolved, but its core purpose remains unchanged: to defend our right to remember, to understand, and to connect with the countless voices that came before us. The Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, who understood better than most the sacred nature of books, once wrote, "I have always imagined that paradise will be a kind of library." Our paradise is not lost. It is fragmented, wounded, and incomplete, but it is still here, waiting for us to piece it back together. This is where the story truly belongs to you. The war on memory is not a relic of the distant past. It is an ongoing conflict, and each of us must choose which side we are on. You can be a guardian. Value knowledge in all its forms, from the ancient manuscript to the local archive to the family photo album. Support your libraries, engage with history, and become curious about the stories that are missing from the dominant narrative. Every time you do, you are registering a victory against silence. Thank you for joining me on this exploration into the shadows of our past. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What does protecting our collective memory mean to you? How can we, together, build a future that is wiser and more inclusive than the fractured past we inherited? The conversation, just like the work of preservation, is never truly finished. But this journey doesn't have to end here. If these stories of forgotten libraries and rescued voices have captivated you, consider joining this ongoing quest to protect our shared past. Liking this video and subscribing to the channel with notifications on is a fantastic way to ensure you don't miss our next deep dive into history's hidden corners. Your engagement helps bring these vital, lesser-known stories to a wider audience, turning passive viewing into active preservation. For those feeling inspired to explore further, be sure to check the description box below. I've packed it with links to incredible digital archives where you can explore medieval manuscripts for yourself, as well as organizations dedicated to the physical conservation of these fragile treasures. Many of them rely on public support, and even a small donation can help fund the technology that resurrects a lost text or preserves a fragile page for future generations. I'm also incredibly curious to hear your thoughts. After this journey through all that was lost, which vanished codex would you most wish to see recovered? Would it be a suppressed scientific treatise that could rewrite our understanding of the medieval mind, a lost epic poem that could rival Beowulf, or perhaps the personal diary of a monk that would reveal the unvarnished human truth of his time? Share your choice down in the comments and let's get a conversation started about the books that fire our collective imagination. Your voice is now a part of this story. While we can never change the past, our stewardship of memory today will absolutely determine the richness and inclusivity of the future we build together. Thank you so much for your time and your profound curiosity. History, after all, is never just about what remains, it's about what we, as a society, actively choose to remember.